I'm Anna,
I'm Jessica.
and this is the Paranoia Pair.
In that documentary I was telling you about, there was
I want to watch it so bad.
honestly
I heard it's crazy.
like everybody sucks in it. The boyfriend, okay, the main girl, Lauren, the one who was bullied by her mom, she was dating this boy Owen, and they had like a little bit of him on the documentary, and he fucking sucked. Like the way he talked about her was like so like he's like, yeah, I mean, she was pretty emotional about it or what. Like he was like so nonchalant about her. And then he had this best friend, Chloe, who wasn't nice to Lauren. And I'm like, okay, why would you? They and him and Lauren were together for 2 years. And I'm like, why would you even be friends with this girl if she's mean to your girlfriend? And then that Chloe girl, she was accused at first of the cyberbullying, and her parents were like talking about it, like about how they're like, well, she had a lot of friends, so some would say that like maybe they were just jealous and that's why they were accusing her. And like everyone on that fucking documentary sucked except the dad and the daughter, and like the daughter's all messed up and she's like, well, she's my mom and I want to still be able to talk to my mom and I still love her. Yeah, like she's still like,
All because the mom had a crush on her boyfriend.
that's one of the theories. The other thing was that someone, like one of the people, the detectives or something, were saying that it's kind of like that Munchauser by proxy,
Mm-hmm.
um to where she wasn't making her daughter physically sick, but she was making it to where her daughter needed her, that she was bullying her daughter so her daughter would come home and need her mom because she was so sad and hurt.
What?
So like she was doing it so that way she could like be like, "Oh no, come here, mommy's got you. Mommy can help you." And yeah. How do you like I
Because,
didn't
like, at least with Gypsy Rose, like, she was the only parent.
I don't
So
like I don't like Gypsy Rose now, like
I
as
don't
a
either.
personality. But like I also don't think that like what I think is wrong was the boy, her manipulating the boy and him going to prison
Mm-hmm.
and her being free. But if you get all that out of the way, like, you know, the right and wrongs with those two,
Mm-hmm.
I don't I don't care that her mom got killed. Like that's
No, I don't
pretty
either.
it's pretty whatever, I guess.
Yeah.
Like um
I think her mom deserved to die, but, like, I don't like how she's like, it was all this boyfriend's fault and blah, blah, blah.
and then he's in prison still.
Yeah.
I'm ready to learn.
Okay. So you have heard of the Titanic, obviously. It was a massive luxury ship who hit an iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic. And it took over 1,500 lives. But there was another shipwreck that has claimed more lives, supposedly. No one fucking talks about it. I've never heard of this before. So I'm going to be talking about the Sultana today. It is a steamboat that got completely overshadowed by other historical events, and so no one really knows about it. The Sultana was built in Cincinnati, Ohio. Hey, Ohio. In February in 1863, and it was pretty large. It was measured to be 260 feet long and approximately 70 feet wide. So if you need visuals like me, because you can tell me anything and that number means nothing to me, I need to visualize it. It's roughly the same length as a Boeing 747, so like the big airplanes that we fly on to go places, which measures about 250 to 260 feet long.
For someone who doesn't look at airplanes a lot,
Have
that
you
doesn't
ever
help.
been on an airplane?
When I was like 8,
Oh,
I don't look at a lot of airplanes.
I
I'm just looking up steamboats.
oh okay.
That looks like a pretty hefty prize. Oh yeah. I'm gonna visualize it as this.
um, okay, that works for me. Probably a little bigger than that though.
I'm gonna go with that in my head now.
Okay. During this time, the American Civil War was taking place, so there were regulations that needed to be followed. Still, they weren't really enforced because the main focus was, of course, the war. And they needed boats to transport men and materials. And kind of that just basically like overruled basically everything. The Sultana was built for the New Orleans cotton trade, but was used for transporting troops and supplies on the Mississippi River during the first 2 years of the Union Army. After Vicksburg, Mississippi was captured in July of 1863, it would go on to carry cotton, manufactured goods, and civilian passengers between New Orleans and St. Louis, Missouri. The Sultana was sold in the spring of 1864 to a group of St. Louis businessmen. One of the businessmen would be the captain, and he was 34-year-old James Cass Mason. Times were tough in the Mississippi trade, and there seemed to be more steamboats than there were goods. And in mid April 1865, Captain Mason set off downriver with the Sultana, and he made the fastest trip ever upriver for any steamboat at that time. And because it was so fast, the Sultana was given a set of elk antlers, which was a symbol of a speedy steamboat. And I don't really know how they settled on elk antlers. Maybe they're just really fast. I don't know.
I feel like elk are pretty fast.
Probably. Apparently they used to use reindeer antlers.
Will seem fast.
I mean, if they can pull Santa's sleigh. Captain Mason was so excited and proud that he immediately placed the antlers on the lower bracing between the twin smokestacks that he had. On April 9th, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, Virginia. This effectively would be the beginning of the end of the Civil War. And on the morning of April 15th, while the Sultana was sitting in Cairo, Illinois, news broke out over a telegraph that President Abraham Lincoln had been assassinated while watching a play. So, Captain Mason, knowing that the telegraph communication with the South had been cut off because of the war, he headed towards New Orleans, hoping to be the first boat to spread the news of Lincoln's death. On his way to New Orleans, Captain Mason stopped at Vicksburg, Mississippi, and there he was approached by Captain Reuben Benton Hatch, the chief quartermaster in Vicksburg. He knew the captain, and he also knew that he was kind of hurting for money because of the lack of cotton trade going on right now. So he gave him a job offer. Captain Hutch also was known to take bribes, and he was also court-martialed for it, but because his brother was Secretary of State for Illinois, he never appeared. And it was just all cool and dandy. Which I don't think is a surprise. Following the end of the Civil War in 1865, both Confederate and Unionists were releasing war prisoners from both sides. Almost 5,000 recently paroled Union soldiers who had just recently been held captive by the Confederates in rebel prisons at Andersonville, Georgia, and Caba, Alabama, were being released to be sent home. They had all been brought to a smaller camp outside Vicksburg, Mississippi, and they needed passage to go north. So, a note about these prison camps to kind of understand more is these places were like brutal, obviously. Andersonville, for example, is one of the most infamous camps, and it was overcrowded, disease ridden, and lacked basic necessities like food and clean water. Prisoners were crammed into tiny spaces, often with no shelter, and they had to survive basically on nothing, which was a battle in itself. And so, overall, the morality rates in these prisons on both sides were very similar and really, really high. So, the steamboats were being paid by the US government per man and per 100 miles to take these men home, which I would say is a good deal.
Yeah, it sounds like really good.
Yeah. Hatch proposed to Mason that he could guarantee that the Sultana got at least 1,000 men, which was worth, at the time, $2,500. Do you want to guess how much that is today?
80,000.
A little more than 40,000. So if Captain Mason, which I feel is still pretty good, 40,000
Just returning prisoners?
Yeah. So Captain Mason, if he accepted this job, would have to give him a small percentage.
Don't tell me all these people who just got out of prison are the one that die.
Mm,
My God.
So now both men knew that the legal carrying capacity of the Sultana was only 376 passengers. And that does not include the 80 to 85 man crew. But Mason agreed anyways. This is like,
Prisoners, they gotta be skinny.
yeah.
I mean, 2 prisoners per person.
They're just coming out of a death camp, so.
Yeah.
He continued downriver, spreading the news of the assassination before coming to get the Union soldiers. On April 23rd, 1865, the Sultana made its way back into Vicksburg from downriver. There was a problem, though. It had sprung a leak in one of the four boilers and it needed to be repaired. While the work was being done to fix the boiler, the recently released soldiers began showing up. So that's where the next problem comes in. There's people here and it's not fixed yet. Instead of 1,000 soldiers, as Captain Hatch had mentioned, the Sultana took almost 2,000.
Yeah, can you repeat that? Instead of how many?
Instead of 1,000 soldiers, they took 2,000.
But you said that the boat only could take 200 and something?
300 and I think 376 and 2,000 has showed up. So they put these men wherever they could fit them. If a person
They were used to it at this point.
Literally, if a person could fit into a space, that's where they were going because Captain Mason and Captain Hutch knew the more men they took, the more money they would be getting.
I don't know. I think I just walk home.
There were so many people on the top deck that they had to put in additional support beams because it was sagging.
Yeah, I'm walking home.
They got away with having this many people on board because the person in charge of loading the men went on a lunch break and he wasn't aware that an additional train car had shown up with more soldiers.
How long was his lunch break?
I don't know. But when he returned, he was under the impression that the other two boats there were bribing to get men, but they had a smallpox outbreak on their ship. And with the recently released prisoners of war's immune systems being so weak, they would rather ride on an overcrowded ship than be exposed to smallpox, which is valid because it was one of the most deadly diseases that plagued the soldiers during the time. So, like, they did not want smallpox. April 24th, 1865, in the very late evening, the Sultana finally started upriver on its journey. Captain Mason chose not to repair the ship's boiler as extensively as needed and instead settled on a quick temporary fix. He was more worried about the Union soldiers finding another vessel to take if he waited to get his boiler fixed correctly. And on board was a total of 2,137 people.
I wonder how much extra weight that was. It'd be cool to know like how much the ship weighed before and after.
I'm gonna get into it. It was bad. So 1,960 of those people were ex-prisoners of war, 22 were guards, 85 were crew members, and 70 were paying passengers. Jessica, there was an alligator on this fucking ship in a wooden cage.
Poor guy.
Many of the paroled soldiers were in poor condition, having just left Confederate hospitals and prisons. So not only was the ship overcrowded in the boiler and was in need of correct repair, but it also was just a terrible night to be out on the water because the Mississippi River had high water levels from the melting snow up north. There were also fallen trees and other debris mixed in to the fast-moving river. When the Sultana would pass a southbound steamboat or a small farm, the men would crowd to one side and like wave and yell because they were just so excited to see other people. And like, I mean, I would be excited too if like I was kept in a prison and I was finally free and I got to like see other people.
I mean, there's like 1,000 other people on the boat with you right now.
Yeah.
You can look at them.
Yeah. But like, just like outsiders.
I
Like
just
you
feel
see all these other people like every day, like new people.
I just feel like you're gonna feel the boat tip and be like, oh, maybe we
Yeah.
shouldn't do that again.
Yeah. So that shifted the weight in the boat majorly because of the overcrowding, and Captain Mason was worried about the boat capsizing. When the weight on the Sultana shifted, the water in its boilers moved unevenly, and one boiler would end up nearly empty, getting superheated by the fire underneath because of it shifting so much. When the boat leveled out again, the water rushed back into the overheated boiler, instantly turning to steam. The sudden pressure built up and was extremely dangerous, especially since the boilers were already under strain from the floodwaters and because it's so fucking overcrowded and heavy.
In my head, that the extra steam would make the boat go zooming.
Because of this, Captain Mason told the men that they needed to stay in place. On the morning of April 26th, 1865, the Sultana stopped at Helena, Arkansas, where photographer Thomas W. Banks was able to take a picture of the overcrowded steamboat. Around 7 o'clock p.m., the Sultana reached Memphis, where about 300,000 pounds of sugar was removed. So not only were there over 2,000 passengers, there was also 300,000 pounds of sugar. Even with the 300,000 pounds of sugar on the boat, it was still tilting because of the top load of the people. So after it was removed, it was tilting even more. So about 200 passengers got off the boat and went to a bar to drink in the meantime.
Jesus.
Yeah. Some soldiers didn't make it back in time before the Sultana departed again around 1 o'clock a.m. on April 27th. After taking on a new load of coal, as well as even more passengers, the Sultana finally started on its last leg of the journey towards Cairo, Illinois. Then the men were to be transferred to trains and taken to Camp Chase near Columbus, Ohio, where they were released from duty and able to go home. For some, the trip had already tested their resourcefulness. Two young soldiers managed to scrape sugar from a broken barrel and ate it like by the spoon, desperate for food because they only had one cook on board for all of these people. So it was overcrowded and space was so scarce that many passengers resorted to sleeping on staircases.
Imagine having diarrhea. Terrible. Bathroom,
Dude,
the bathrooms are just packed
that
constantly.
toilet is overflowing.
Well, imagine all the poop in the
Oh my
river.
God, have you heard of the poop cruise?
Yeah.
I'm imagining it'd be like that. At approximately 2 a.m. on April 27th, 7 miles from Memphis, Tennessee, one of the Sultana's boilers exploded. Because the boat had been so packed, many of the passengers were crammed right by the boilers. The explosion instantly killed hundreds, mostly soldiers from Kentucky and Tennessee who had been packed in right against the boilers. Many of them instantly died from shrapnel, steam, and the boiling water that was released from the explosion. Other passengers were awakened by the blast, unaware of what had happened. One of the surviving soldiers explains he thought the boat had been attacked. The force of the blast sent people flying into the air and into the river, and then another two boilers exploded. The explosion ripped apart the center of the main cabin, destroyed the middle of the upper deck section of the steamboat that housed the crew's quarters, and cut off 2/3 of the pilot house. Since the explosion didn't come from the furnace boxes, the Sultana didn't catch fire right away, but within 20 minutes, the Sultana was engulfed in flames. Private William H. Fogelman stood up from his bed and suddenly steam was escaping the boiler and it was scalding his face and arms. He sucked in a breath and then the steam was so hot it scalded his lips and burnt the mucous membrane off of his tongue. This didn't stop him though because he and another private named William C. Nixon.
Oh, that would have stopped me.
Yeah. He attempted to locate buckets to extinguish the flames in hopes of saving the boat and a condition where it could at least still float. Unfortunately, the buckets had been misplaced by the soldiers that were being housed in the boiler room for fetching water from the river to drink. So they had no way to fight the fire effectively. With 3 of the 4 boilers gone, the giant smokestacks lost their support and came crashing down. One fell into the massive hole in the middle of the boat, while the other slammed into the crowd that was on the hurricane deck, which then collapsed onto the packed second deck below. Tragically, dozens of soldiers were crushed between the decks. Some were lucky enough to be saved by the sturdy railings around the main stairway, though. Many people had been catapulted into the river by the force of the explosion, while hundreds more fought to get away from the spreading flames and to find scraps of lumber to keep them afloat in the water. People trapped in the wreckage cried out for assistance as men, women, and children who were lucky enough jumped into the icy cold river. Many of the soldiers, emaciated from their time in Confederate camps, soon lost their strength and grabbed onto anything that might help them stay afloat. Harvey Annis, his wife Anne, and their 4-year-old daughter Belle were staying in the stateroom. After Harvey had witnessed the chaos and the flames, he tied a life belt around himself and his wife Anne and placed his daughter Belle on his back and told her to hold on tight and not let go. He tied a rope to the stern of the boat and was lowering himself and his daughter Belle down. He told Anne to follow, and she began to lower herself, and then another passenger jumped on top of her and knocked her into the hole on the deck. Harvey and Belle made it safely to the water, and he started pedaling to safety. While readjusting her life belt, Anne witnessed soldiers in the water panicking and grabbing a hold of Harvey and Belle, and they drowned.
Oh.
She later jumped into the river, clinging onto a small piece of debris to survive, and helped pull men out of the water when she reached safety. So,
The little
like,
girl?
no, the wife.
Oh.
So like she had witnessed her daughter and her husband drown, and
Oh.
she like made it to safety and was helping pull people out of the water. During the beginning of the explosion, the Sultana's bow faced the wind, so the flames were being pushed back towards the boat. People up front calmed down for a little bit while those trapped behind in the fire were jumping into the water. Things kind of took a turn when one of the big paddle wheel boxes broke loose and fell into the river, causing the steamboat to spin around completely. So, like, it's turning around in the water and there's people in the water. So like they're getting fucked up by this boat and people are also like drowning each other cuz they're panicking. Um so the folks who had sought refuge on the bow also now found themselves in the direct path of the fire. About 400 men and a few women had crowded together at the bow as the flames bore down on them. By this point, most of the debris floating in the river had been snatched up by the first group. There was no other options now for the people who were still on board, and they began pushing and shoving their way into the icy water and clinging onto each other, uh, trying to stay afloat and survive. Captain Mason stayed on board the Sultana. He was seen on each deck throwing debris on board, hoping to help some of the passengers in the water. Several crew members told him that it was time to get off the boat, and he told them he still needed to help out, and he refused to leave. His body was never found. If you're wondering about the alligator, because I needed to know what happened to the alligator. Um, Private William Luganbeal said that he killed the alligator using his bayonet, and then he threw it overboard, grabbed the crate, and jumped into the river and used it as a flotation device.
That poor alligator was like having a bad day as it got
Apparently,
captured,
yeah.
thrown in a little box,
Mhm.
getting thrown around,
Yeah.
survived being crushed, drowned, everything else. Like I was kind of wondering when it started with like were there going to be a bunch of alligators eating off the people?
I was also concerned about the alligator. I was like, they have an alligator on board.
That'd be pretty strong. I guess the alligator might not have been that big.
I'm wondering how big this alligator was.
To throw a whole alligator out, that's crazy.
Yeah. Not long after the Sultana exploded, the steamboat Bostana #2 came across the devastating scene. The crew and passengers sprang into action, throwing anything that could float. Doors, shutters, planks, even chairs into the water to help them stay afloat. They managed to rescue around 150 people, but the scale of the disaster was overwhelming. Captain John Watson decided to head downriver to Memphis as fast as possible to spread the word and get more help. By the time the Bostona reached Memphis, the news of the disaster had already arrived. Further upriver, closer to the wreckage, hundreds of survivors had managed to cling onto flooded treetops or rooftops of submerged barns and outbuildings. That's how bad the flooding was. As dawn began to break, casting light on the horrific aftermath, the soldiers, civilians, and crew who had endured the explosion and freezing waters anxiously waited to be rescued, and many still were fighting for their lives in the water. Around 7 a.m., the still burning hulk of the Sultana floated in among a group of flooded trees um, atop of Hen Island, and that's a few miles northwest of Memphis. A handful of survivors climbed back up on the bow of the boat and fought back the flames while John Fogelman and his sons set out using a raft they had quickly crafted to rescue them. To save time, they would set the people off in the treetops and go back to the boat to take more off, so they didn't have to make the whole trip back to land. It only took a few hours before the Sultana reached the bottom of the Mississippi. The rescue efforts following the Sultana disaster were remarkable, especially considered the recent end of the Civil War. Confederate soldiers, who just weeks earlier might have been fighting these Union soldiers, were saving their lives. Many Union survivors ended up on the Arkansas side of the river, which had been under Confederate control during the war. And Confederate soldiers and local residents worked together to pull Union soldiers from the freezing waters, and they offered them shelter and aid. Altogether, 786 people had to be rescued and taken to hospitals or the Soldiers' Home, which was kind of like the Civil War era United Service Organization. When they ran out of room in the area, people opened up their homes to the survivors. Most of the survivors were badly injured with scalds and broken bones, and nearly everybody was battling exhaustion. So, of the roughly 50 women and children aboard the Sultana, only 4 or 5 women made it out alive, and 2 civilian passengers and a couple crew members. None of the children survived.
Oh.
As rescuers pulled bodies from the river, they placed them in pine coffins along the waterfront, but Memphis ran out of coffins. The remaining victims were laid side by side on the levee, covered with blankets or cloth. With the river at the flooded stage and rushing fast, many of those lost were never recovered. Bodies from the Sultana wreckage had continued to surface downriver even months after the accident. Many of them were never found. Even after being rescued, though, approximately a third of those that were rescued would succumb to their injuries. The Sultana disaster claimed the lives of approximately 1,800 people, and the journey is still not over for these men. The surviving prisoners left Memphis in 3 large groups and then in 2s and 3s, climbing onto steamboats and going upriver to Cairo, Illinois.
Hell no, I'm not getting on another boat.
Yeah. Where they were transferred to a terrain and shipped to Camp Chase, Ohio.
Ohio did make that steamboat.
Mm-hmm.
The steamboat that...
Yeah, nothing good comes out of Ohio. Literally. Some were sent out just 2 days after the incident. On their way back, they would pass the same spot where the Sultana sank, and sticking out of the water was its jackstaff. One of the men was so terrified that he spent the whole trip in a lifeboat.
That's so valid.
Yeah. And every time the whistle would blow, he would prepare himself to jump. Other men vowed to never board a steamboat again. I don't think I'd be able to. Soldiers from the Knoxville area decided they were going to walk to Nashville to catch a train home. The tragedy goes overlooked, though. The newspapers and Americans focus on Lincoln's funeral train, and his assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was tracked down and killed on April 26, just 1 day before the disaster. Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston surrendered to Union General William T. Sherman that same day in North Carolina, and the Confederate President Jefferson Davis was on the run and being pursued by the Union cavalry. So lots of monumental things were happening at the same time. Newspapers along the Mississippi were also paid heavily by the steamboat corporations and had a great relationship. The Steamboat Corporation didn't want word to get out about what happened because they didn't want people to stop buying steamboat tickets and hurt the industry. The investigation into the event began that very same morning in Memphis. The main focus was the loading of the boat. On January 1866, Captain Frederick Speed, who had been at the parole camp sending men out to the Sultana, was put on trial for overloading the Sultana. Captain Speed was found guilty, but after reviewing the case, the Judge Advocate General of the Army overturned the convictions, stating that Captain Hatch was responsible for the overcrowding. Reuben Hatch, however, ignored 3 subpoenas and was nowhere to be found when a U.S. Marshal was sent to arrest him. So he was never brought to trial. So ultimately, no one was ever held accountable for what happened. Survivors and families of victims did try to seek compensation after the Sultana disaster, but the process was complicated, to say the least. Many survivors were Union soldiers, and while some received pensions for their military service, there wasn't a specific fund or widespread effort to compensate them for the disaster of the Sultana itself. Legal claims were difficult to pursue. For many survivors, rebuilding their lives was a struggle. They faced physical injuries, emotional trauma, and financial hardships. And after the disaster, Anne Annis returned to Wisconsin where she tried to rebuild her life. Her survival was remarkable, but the emotional toll of losing her family in such a horrific way stayed with her. She did not receive specific compensation for the loss of her husband and daughter. And survivors and families of victims sought support. The focus was often on military pensions for the Union soldiers rather than civilian passengers like Anne. Private Epentus Washington McIntosh boarded the Sultana after being exchanged as a prisoner of war. After enduring the horrors of Andersonville, he was only 80 pounds. When the explosion occurred, he was thrown into the river amidst the chaos, surrounded by screams and groans of agony. Despite his weakened state, he managed to swim for hours, stripping off his clothes to lighten his load. I don't know how much more you can lighten it if you only weigh 80 pounds.
Literally.
Um, he eventually reached the Arkansas shore where a local man helped him recover. Later, he recounted the disaster, describing the desperate struggle to avoid drowning as others clung to him for support. He spent time recovering at Overton Hospital in Memphis before being transported to Benton Barracks in Missouri. So, because of his injuries from his time in the Confederate camp and the Sultana explosion, he was unable to work or do any manual labor. He used his knowledge of playing instruments and he wrote songs and had cards printed with his story on them and traveled the nation selling them for a living. Because of the death toll being so high, many of the Union soldiers weren't able to get compensation since at the time you needed at least 2 eyewitnesses and a higher ranking officer to confirm that your claim was legit. So you needed 3 witnesses and only like 700 people survived. And then a third of them died after that because of their injuries.
That's a bunch of BS.
That's insane. Some survivors formed the Sultana Survivors Association, and that kind of provided a sense of community and support. The association held annual reunions, helping survivors share their stories and keep the memory of the disaster alive. The last known member of the Sultana Survivors Association was Private Charles M. Eldridge, and he passed away on September 8th, 1941, at the age of 96.
Holy cow.
Yeah. His death marked the end of an era, and he was the final living link to the survivors who had endured the tragedy and worked up to keep the memory alive. And that was until Norman Shaw, a Knoxville attorney and Civil War enthusiast, learned about the Sultana. And in 1987, he decided to see if there was still interest in the Sultana tragedy and organized a meeting at the Sultana Monument in Knoxville in the Mount Olive Cemetery. The response was overwhelming, and dozens of people started attending. And this led to the founding of the Association of the Sultana Descendants and Friends. And it's dedicated to preserving the memory of the disaster and its victims. Since then, the group has held an annual reunion in cities connected to the Sultana story, such as Vicksburg, Memphis, and Andersonville. These gatherings are typically scheduled around the 27th of April, which is the anniversary of the disaster, and it kind of serves as a way for descendants and history enthusiasts to kind of honor the victims and share their stories. And for the 150th anniversary of the disaster in 2015, the city of Marion, Arkansas created a museum that shows how the Sultana explosions happened and memorizes those aboard. And that is all.
That was a really interesting story.
I cannot believe how many people they have on board, plus the 300,000 pounds of sugar. Like, that's crazy. And then they took on a load of coal afterwards.
Yeah, I thought maybe like the coal was going to be for like making steam,
Mm-hmm.
but the fact that I'm assuming it was like more for more profit.
Yeah. I feel so bad for Anne having to watch her husband and her child drown. This validated my fear of boats, by the way.
Yeah, I don't like boats.
I don't either.
No, I'd like fishing boats. No,
Mm-mm.
I
I
like
don't even want to do a kayak.
I like kayaks. I won't do it anymore because the rivers around here have gotten so gross.
Mm-hmm.
But like I gotta be close enough to shore.
With my luck, I would get tipped over, and then I wouldn't know how to get out, and then I would drown. I mean, I can swim. I'm really good at swimming, but like, I panic, and I would probably get stuck upside down.
The last time I went kayaking was actually kind of funny, because they have like two rivers you can kayak, and you get on a bus and they take you like to the starting point, and then you kayak back down to like the place. So we were kayaking, and you can also canoe. Some of them have canoes, and you don't canoe. Never go canoeing with somebody. You have to have the strongest relationship to canoe with someone.
Yeah.
Like I'm a strict kayaker. I'm not sharing my boat with nobody. And there was these two guys, and they apparently got in a fight. They were ahead of us, and we caught up to them, and they had thrown the one had been thrown out of the boat, and the other one was just going away,
Yeah.
and so the one was just having to swim through the river, and some drunk guy let him hold on to the back of his kayak, and he
Oh my
paddled
god.
him the rest of the way to the pickup point. But it was literally just the funniest thing ever, and then we got on the bus, and we were, like, waiting for them to load everything up, and the 2 guys were just storming down the little dirt road, just yelling at each other, and it was just so funny. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Facebook at Paranoia Pair Pod. And we will see you next Friday.
Stay spooky.
See you next time.
Toodaloo.